Mr Acting Deputy President, I rise this evening to speak on Uber, the rideshare app that is challenging the current position of the taxi industry, particularly in Queensland. Uber Technologies Incorporated is an American international transportation network company that uses an application or an app that a consumer can download and use on their mobile phone. Uber is a digital disruptor that is currently avoiding Commonwealth and state laws. Uber may be popular amongst users, but it is a villain to Queensland taxi drivers, regulators, employment law and government revenue. Even some UberX drivers are now realising how little money they are making, approximately $10.70 an hour, once all operating and self-employment costs are taken into account. Uber drivers, in particular UberX drivers, do not use professional drivers, nor do they use modified commercially insured vehicles. And currently in Queensland, it is the Department of Transport and Main Roads who decides who can drive who around and who administers the law that governs the licences for drivers. And Mr Acting Deputy President, in my home state of Queensland, Uber is illegal under the Transport Operations Passenger Transport Act 2005 in Queensland, which requires a person to have authorisation to operate a public passenger vehicle providing public passenger service. The previous LNP government issued a cease and desist order to Uber. Between June 2014 and June 2015, Uber drivers in Queensland have received more than $1.7 million in fines. Yet, Mr Acting Deputy President, we see Uber continue to grow in popularity, in particular with young consumers and drivers who own late model vehicles in search of extra income. As you know, Mr Acting Deputy President, the Coalition Government believes in enterprise and small business, and that is why I find this issue a particularly vexing one. On one hand, I applaud the entrepreneurial spirit of Uber and those seeking to make public transport more efficient and user-friendly. But at the same time, I feel for small businesses, the mum and dad business taxi owners who have bought a legitimate and legal taxi licence that costs on average $390,000 in my home state of Queensland. And currently, there are 3,264 cabs in service across Queensland, and these cabs are owned by more than 2,800 owners. More than 1,200 companies are taxi operators, while the industry employs more than 15,000 drivers. Around 48% of all these licences in Queensland are held by small operators with less than 5 taxis. Taxi service licences are sold by competitive tender by the state government in a geographical area, and these licences may be bought and sold as assets. The cost of these licences vary due to geographical areas in which they operate. And furthermore, there are overheads that do not apply to Uber, but apply to taxis because they can operate. These include taxi service licences and accreditation. And unlike Uber taxis, they must serve passengers in sequential order, either in terms of when their phone or their app booking is received, or where they are in a taxi rank queue. The exceptions are made for wheelchair-accessible taxis, as they must give priority to passengers in a wheelchair or on a mobility scooter. Be no more than 6 years old, so the car must be no more than 6 years old for a wheelchair-accessible vehicle, and they must have a taximeter installed. They must also provide itemised receipts on request and must accept all methods of electronic payment. They must hold open licences for more than 12 months, pass daily criminal history checks and obtain a medical certificate for motor vehicle driving. They must also pass a national minimum English standards assessment, complete a driver training course, and every vehicle must have a 6-month inspection and subsequent certificate of inspection. Uber drivers do not have these overheads and regulations, creating an unfair advantage. Their drivers are not required to have a blood alcohol level of 0 when driving customers. They do not have to have safeguards for the customer, and a driver is not under any obligation to ensure that they are not fatigued. And various states and territories have placed obligations and levies on the taxi industry, especially in the area of passenger safety. Members of the Queensland taxi industry must pay a security levy to the state government to address antisocial behaviour at the taxi rank on weekend nights. Other mandated safety costs require every taxi to have 3 GPS locators installed and an improved security system that is installed and operational. Additionally, one of the GPS locators must be contained within the security camera and be able to withstand high temperatures in case the taxi is ever incinerated. This ensures that any footage and GPS data can still be accessed. These safety features further add to the costs of the service obligations placed on the industry. I acknowledge that Uber falls under state and territory jurisdictions with regards to passenger transportation laws. I also acknowledge that these laws may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I also understand that the ACT and Western Australian governments have offered a strong indication that Uber is likely to be able to operate after an innovative industry review. I'm also advised that Victoria has taken steps to accommodate Uber into its existing regulatory regime, although the service remains illegal. And south of the Tweed, the New South Wales Government has announced the launch of an independent task force to examine the future sustainability of taxis, hire cars and other emerging point-to-point transport providers' ride-sharing models. The task force will also examine the possible impact of any regulatory changes on existing investors and, if necessary, will make recommendations on possible adjustment packages. With some states and territories looking to legalise Uber, it is clear that the national consensus will not be reached. And whilst regulating Uber is of course necessary to maintain public safety and ensure Uber and its drivers meet their tax and other obligations, removal of constricting layers of red tape is necessary to enable the small business operators to survive in an ever-competitive market. Uber is a multinational business based in California with a value of over $51 billion US. It claims that it does not employ drivers but simply partners with drivers. In geographical areas with over 10,000 people, service contracts for taxis exist between the state and booking companies. All vehicles in the geographical areas are required to be associated with a specific booking company, and in Brisbane, this includes black and white and cabs and yellow cabs. Booking companies are obliged by law to provide a universal service, and this means they are required to have a specific number of taxis on the road spread across a geographical area. Taxis are required by law not to discriminate. They are to provide services for the disabled and must undertake school pickups compared to UberX, who only takes those that download the app. Booking companies are required to take bookings by telephone as well as electronic means. And unlike Uber, taxi call centres employ people compared to a swipe of a mobile screen. Maximum fares for taxis are gazetted. There is no maximum gazetted fare for Uber. Surge pricing during peak usage can see some users paying more than 3 times or more than for the usual fare. Taxi fares may be paid using a variety of means, predominantly cash or card, whereas Uber patrons register their credit cards using the app before utilising the service, with the final transaction occurring overseas. In May 2015, the ATO declared that Uber drivers need to register for GST from the 1st of August or face appropriate consequences. It is my understanding that a legal challenge is underway against the ATO in the Federal Court. As noted previously, Mr Acting Deputy President, the billing for Uber transactions occurs overseas at 3% in Singapore. One can only assume how much or how little income tax is paid by Uber in Australia. To date, the Queensland Government has not undertaken a review of ride-sharing services or pointed towards reform in this area. However, Queensland's taxi strategy expires at the end of 2015, and what is clear is a dual approach is required. A number of states are moving to legalise and regulate ride-share apps. I call on the Queensland Labor Government to even the ledger and to look at strategies that even up the playing field so that everyone gets a fair go. The taxi industry is an integral part of the wider public transport network and plays a vital role for the sick, the elderly, the disabled and those who live in areas not serviced by traditional public transport. They are very good examples of deregulation of the taxi industry. There are very good examples of deregulation of the taxi industry internationally, with varying degrees of standards implemented and benefits for both the taxi industry and consumers. For example, our New Zealand neighbours removed quantitative restrictions on the number of taxi licences in 1989. And after deregulation, the number of taxis, like in other deregulated markets, increased substantially. New Zealand experience demonstrates that deregulation, the removal of quantity or price controls without appropriate introduction of quality standards, can bring about restructuring of the industry in a way that benefits both consumers and suppliers alike. Mr Acting Deputy President, a fair go for all is all that I asked. While competition is desirable in any market, it must occur on an even playing field where all participants are subject to the same market entry requirements.
Thank you very much, Senator.